Bible to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We're going to talk about head coverings this morning. I bet you all woke up this morning and said, man, I really hope Pastor Stuart talks about head coverings. Unravels that little mystery. All right, nobody? All right, nobody probably ever thought that one was coming up this morning, but that's what we're going to talk about. Actually, this passage really isn't about head coverings at all. This really has to do with authority in the church. Paul is instructing the Corinthians about their proper relationships between men and women in the church and the authority that God has given to men to lead his church. All right, that's really the issue. The issue is about male leadership in the church, and he uses this issue of the head coverings to talk about that. So Paul is going to instruct the men and the women about how they're supposed to respond and work with each other within the church. So he teaches that men are God's chosen leaders in the church, not because they're inherently better, but because they are selected to fulfill this role by his grace. All right, everybody take a deep breath. All right, take a deep breath and just let all of that come out of you, whatever animosity you might have to something like this passage. This is really a monumental passage when we talk about the role of men and women in the church. And if you are new here, I promise you this is not a topic we visit all the time. You just happen to pick the greatest Sunday to come. All right? And I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to apologize for what the Word of God says about this. This is something that we need to embrace. And we are going to be directly swimming upstream from the culture today. This is usually, we are almost all the time we're swimming upstream against the culture, but we're going directly against the culture this morning by the glory of God and the grace of God, right? So this morning, the question is, who does God choose to lead his church? And the answer to that is found here. Now, Paul mentions this because there are two problems in the church in Corinth. They are two problems that plague every church in the history of the world, and specifically this church. Here are the two problems that are present in the church in Corinth, and you tell me if these are two problems that are present in every church. One is aggressive women, and the second is passive men. Is that a problem in every church? It's a problem in every church. It's ever existed in the history of the world, and good thing that Paul addresses it here. We have women who are being too aggressive in their desire to rule over the church, and then you have men who are passive in their role and not doing what they're supposed to be and becoming the leaders that they're supposed to be. So who does God choose to rule over his church, to be the leaders, to be in the one's authority? He chooses men. Why do human beings then generally reject that kind of authority? Because that's who we are. We are people who reject authority. As people, not just men and women, I'm talking about all people. How many of you like to submit? It's like, man, I just love to submit. Anybody tells me to do something, I'm like, I am submissive to you. I just roll over on my belly like a dog and scratch my belly, right? That's just who I am. I like to do that. Said nobody ever. Right? Nobody ever said that. I had us read that passage in Luke chapter 20 because the people in Jesus' day did not want to submit to his authority. They asked him, whose authority are you doing these things by? I just wanted to re-emphasize this one point, that nobody likes to submit to authority. It doesn't matter if you're a man, it doesn't matter if you're a woman. It doesn't matter if you're a little kid, it doesn't matter if you're an older person, or not an older person, or not a young person. If you're in the middle there somewhere, nobody likes to submit to authority. That's just who we are. In Numbers chapter 16, Korah did not want to submit to the leadership of Moses, and so he says, all of the congregation is holy. In other words, all of us should be able to do and to say whatever we want to do. That is the prevailing attitude of all humanity. The book of Judges is typical of that, where it says there was no king in Israel, but everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And how well did that work out in the book of Judges? Probably the worst book in the whole Bible in terms of people and their lives and how we see anarchy just overtake things. We need authority in our lives. Whether we like it or not, we need authority in our lives. And this passage re-emphasizes that. So let me just show you how this works. In the church, men men generally don't like to submit to Christ in eldership. So they reject eldership, they reject authority in the church. Women, generally speaking, reject men and their authority over women. Kids reject parents and their authority over them. You all know what I'm talking about there. And then, as a whole, we all reject our government and everything they say. So we don't like to submit to authority. That is just who we are. And in this passage, you're going to see this word pop up all over this passage. It's the word head. It's not a very complicated word, but we've tried to make it very complicated in the world that we live in. And that one in verse 3 is extremely problematic. Well, let's just read it, and you can see how many times. Just count for yourselves how many times the word head pops up in this passage. Okay, look at verse 2. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firm to the traditions, just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head, for she is the one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgraceful thing for women to have her hair cut off from her head or have it shaved, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to have his head uncovered, since he is the image and the glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed, man was not created for woman's sake, but women for the man's sake. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. However, in the Lord, neither is a woman independent of man, nor is a man independent of woman. For as the man originates from the man, or from the woman, verse 12. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman. And all things originate from God. Judge for yourself. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even her nature itself teach that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is the glory of her. For her hair is given to her for a covering. But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. How clear is that to you? About as clear as mud, right? This is a really, really confusing passage. If you're counting, I had 14 different times that we see the word head pop up in this passage. That's because, and yours might vary because the word head itself only occurs 10 times in the Greek, but it occurs many other times because it's supplied by the translator to give you the correct understanding of this. And it's not a very difficult word. The word kephale in Greek, head, appears 10 times, and it can mean either your physical head, okay, that watermelon that sits at the top of your shoulders, or it can mean a cornerstone uniting two walls. It can mean a ruler, or a lord, or the head of something, like the head of a corporation, or the head of a tribe, or the head of something like that. It is the ruling part of the body. Now here is the big problem. Because of feminism in our culture, many have argued that the word head does not mean head. So verse 3 is extremely, extremely contested in the world in which we live. Whole books have been written about verse 3, just so you're aware. And you'll see the problem immediately when you read verse 3. Just read it with me. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man. Have we gotten to the controversial part yet? No, that's no problem, right? Christ is the head of every man. Do we all agree that Christ is the head of every man? Okay, that's not a difficult one. And the man is the head of a woman. Have we gotten to the controversial part? Yes, we have. Major controversy. And then, and God, notice this, is the head of Christ. Do we have a problem with that part? No, that's not a problem at all. Okay, so it's only that middle part that we have a real issue with. And the issue is what does it mean for the man to be the head over the woman. And what does this mean? So feminists will argue that Peter and Paul and men like them are chauvinists. That when they write the New Testament, they get a lot of things right, but when you come to verses like this, they clearly had problems with women. And so there is an issue here with chauvinism where Paul is saying that women need to submit to men because clearly Paul had some issue with women that he didn't quite clear up in his own mind and in his own heart, and so it kind of in some ways spills over into other areas. The problem with that is that it is sandwiched between two statements that we have no problem with, that Christ is the head of man and that God is the head of Christ. So what do we do with those verses? Sometime during the early 2000s, I went to a class in Los Angeles, and the class was called Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and for a whole week we talked about this passage. This was a problematic passage. I have a book in my office called Biblical Manhood and Womanhood by John Grudem and John Piper. It's a 400-page book on this passage. So you understand that there's a lot at stake in this, right? How we understand authority and where authority comes from. And they have a whole section on this word head, kephele. What does it mean? Well, it means head, but some people don't want it to mean head. It means something else in their mind. Well, in Ephesians 4, verse 15, we see this word where it says, "But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up into all aspects, into Him who is the head, even Christ." Speaking of Christ as the head of His church. Colossians 1:18, He is also the head of the body, the church, and He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so He Himself will come to have first place in everything. 1 Peter 2:7, "But for those who disbelieve, the stone which the builders rejected, this has become the very cornerstone," or the head cornerstone. So I want you to see how it's used in the New Testament, and that's not the only places. It's used 70 different times in the New Testament, but I want you to see how it's used because I don't think there's any question that when it's used to talk about leadership. It's used about the head of something. If you were to come to a corporation, you would say, "Who's the head of the corporation?" Or you might ask the barista at the Starbucks when they jack up your coffee to say, "Who's the head of this thing? Who's in charge here? Who's the head honcho? Who's the head of the tribe? Who's the person in charge?" I'm trying to get down to we even use that term, the way that we use it is in that sense. It's in a sense of authority. Now, these verses are some of the most problematic verses in the New Testament. There might not be a more difficult passage in the New Testament for us to have to discuss. And truthfully speaking, I'm going to be upfront with you right now. There's a verse in this passage, I still don't know what it means. And that's after a week of studying it. That's after exhausting every resource that I possibly could find. It's after listening to every person that I could possibly think of to listen to. And they all say the same thing. This one verse is so problematic, nobody seems to know what it means. All right? A little intrigued and a little afraid? All right, well, let's hold hands together and we'll walk through this one. All right, first of all, we're just going to talk about, and I don't want you to give you the wrong impression that we don't know what this passage as a whole means. I'm just saying there's one part of it that we don't know what it means. So there are four parts to this authority in the church, and the first is this, what I'll call the chain of command. He gives the chain of command, verses 2 and 3. So Paul tells the Corinthians that everyone is to submit to someone. Everybody submits to somebody. Okay? Man, woman, child, everybody submits to somebody. The question is, what is the chain of command? What's on the org chart, so to speak? Now, God's authority is over Jesus. Jesus' authority is over man, and man's authority is over the woman. So that's the organizational flow chart. If you were looking at this, you'd see at the top of the pyramid, at the top of all authority is God. Then Jesus is submissive to God. That's what this passage says. And then Jesus is over men, and men are over women, and women and men are over children. And then there's, I guess, the dog underneath them. I don't know, right? And so we do have a clear chain of command. If you look at verse 3, that's what it says. Christ is the head over every man. He is Lord, Master, King, God over every man. Secondly, man is the head over the woman. He has authority over the woman, but not ultimate authority over, because Christ is the head. And then there is God who is the head over Christ. I don't think it's really that difficult to understand, but here's the problem that we have. We kind of find ourselves in one of three camps. One camp is called feminism. Feminism says that men are evil, women are good, and women are the solution. Chauvinism says that men are smarter than women, women are dumb and weak, and so men should dominate women. Neither of those are good solutions, are they? Those are both terrible options. So you only end up with a third option, which is what we call complementarianism, which is to say this: men and women are created equal in the sight of God in His image, and yet they have different functions and different roles. That's the complementary view, which is called the Bible. The Bible says that men and women are created in the image of God. Neither one of them are inferior to one another, but they serve and help one another. And that's the biblical view. Interestingly enough, it's funny because the church, in a lot of ways, takes a lot of flack for being anti-women, chauvinistic in some responses. But the interesting thing is, it was the church originally who exalted the worth and the identity of women. Originally speaking, it was the church that elevated the worth of women. In fact, if you go over to Galatians chapter 3, you read words like this, and this is from the Apostle Paul, the supposed chauvinist, who says this: there is neither Greek nor Jew, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Now, in the time that Paul wrote that, those words were revolutionary. Women were not considered to be equal with men. In fact, they were considered to be like animals. They were chattel, they were property that men could do whatever they wanted with in Roman culture. And the culture was saying that men were better than women. But that was the prevailing attitude towards women. Paul comes along and says, no, women are just like men. They are, in terms of value and dignity and worth, they are the same level with men. They just happen to serve in a different way that men serve. Peter says something similar in 1 Peter chapter 3, where he says in verse 7, you husbands in the same way live with your wives in an understanding way, as with somebody weaker, since she is a woman. But he says this: no, show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. You better treat her with respect, Peter says. She is an heir of life. She is a co-heir with you. So the Bible is the place really where people that said that people, regardless of their nationality, social status, gender, and economic position, were all on the same level. That was something that the rest of the world was not saying. It's interesting in the world that we live in that people want to say that the Bible is bigoted, the Bible is racist, the Bible is against women, when in fact it was the Bible who said originally that all are on the same ground at the foot of the cross. See how backwards our world has gotten. The problem is that they misinterpret some of these verses to think that simply because God is saying that women serve a different function, that they are somehow inferior to men. That could not be any more untrue. Because of verses like Ephesians 5, verse 21, and be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. He himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be subject to their husbands. You hear the same language? It's about subjection. It's about willing submission. It's not about beating somebody into submission. It's about willing subjection. And so this is what he's teaching here. He is giving you the chain of command, that God is at the top of that. Now, if we went with the idea that women were somehow inferior because they were subject to men, then you would have to say the same thing about Christ. If Christ is subject to God, then you would have to infer that Christ is inferior to God. Is Christ inferior to God? Not at all. But we do see that Jesus submits himself to the Father, doesn't he? He says that. He says, I don't want to go through this in the Garden of Gethsemane, yet not my will, but your will. We already talked about this last week, but in John chapter 4, he says, it is my food to do the will of the Father. It is my desire, is what he's saying. He says in other parts of John that I can't do anything of my own. I only do what the Father wants me to do. I only say what the Father wants me to say. I can only perform the miracles that the Father wants me to perform. He is saying, I am in subjection to him. Loving, willing subjection to him. That's what the biblical idea of submission means. It is a willingness to say, I trust you, I believe you, that what your way of doing things is better than my way of doing things. But this has been the problem ever since the beginning. This is the problem that popped up in Genesis chapter 3. That the woman was approached by the serpent. She wanted to be God instead of submitting to God. And so she took of the fruit. And the man, by the way, was there like a passive idiot and did nothing. And so you see the problem there. They're both cursed by God because the woman usurps the man's authority and the man is passive, doesn't do what he's supposed to do. Tell the woman, you probably shouldn't listen to a talking snake. So we both have issues, right? And it continues to be a problem, and this continues to be the issue. And if things go the way that God has designed them, then it will go smoothly if men are the ones in authority over the women in a beautiful way in which they are kind and benevolent towards their wives and their kids. That's the way it's designed to be. But this is a problem that pops up all over the place. I became aware of this acutely when I was a junior high pastor in Orange County. Back when I was doing that, I don't even know, 15 years ago, some of our students, after they went away to summer camp, decided they wanted to start a Bible study on their public school campus. I thought that was a great idea, so I cheered them on. Hey, good job. You guys want to do this. So they started to set up this. These were young men, young women. They're junior hires. I mean, how many junior hires would do that, right? I mean, they were willing to do that and really willing to say, hey, we want to start this. So they start this Bible study. Well, it kind of took off, and this went from 20 to 30 to 40 up to 50 people. And I said, so how are things going? They said, well, we have a problem. So, well, what's the problem? They say, well, we have some junior high girls in our group who want to teach. Uh-oh, problem. What are we going to do? I said, what do you think you should do? They said, well, I don't know. That's why we came to you. You're our pastor. I said, well, let's go to the Word of God and let's look at what the Word of God said. So I read in 1 Timothy 2, and we talked about that passage. And they said, okay, I think we need to know what we need to do. So they went back and they talked with these gals, and they said, we recognize that the Bible says that the primary teachers, these are junior hires. Okay, they're dealing with this issue. Wow, you guys have some guts. I said, I'm glad I'm not there. And they were there talking with these gals, and they said, but here's what we would like to do. We would like to occasionally give you the opportunity to teach the other girls in this group, and so we'll split off and we'll do a kind of a guys group and a girls group. What do you think about that? I thought that was a good idea, right? It showed some wisdom on the part of the junior hire, right? And so they did, and the women, those gals who wanted to teach, were able to exercise their giftedness in that way. But it didn't stop there, did it? Because these gals wanted to teach the young men also in this. And so it became a problem, it became an issue. And I just kind of kept pressing them. I said, what's going on here? What's the deal? Why is it that these girls really want to teach these other men? They said, well, we don't know. And it kind of came down to the fact that they had a woman junior high pastor. So then it became more of an issue of just, are we going to, is this the way that the culture is going to go, and are we going to go with the culture's definition of the way the church is? Now we can start arguing immediately about at what point should a woman not teach a man, and when do they become men, and all that kind of stuff. That's a whole other issue, right? But I just think it was interesting. This is like a microcosm of the world that we live in, isn't it? Church becomes this little church inside. It wasn't even really a church, it was just a gathering of believers, which I guess is a church in the most broad terms, became a hotbed issue. And thankfully it didn't become an issue to destroy this Bible study, because that would have been a really awful thing. They continue to move on and kind of work through that issue somehow. I don't even remember how it actually ended. I just thought it was really interesting to me that these junior hires are having to grapple with this issue at 12 years old. Nothing has changed in the world in which we live in because the culture is always trying to affect the church. And the culture is trying to not just affect the church, but infect the church. And it's not ever going to be satisfied with just a little bit of molding it into the shape of this world. And so what does this all have to do with it? It has to do with authority, right? It has to do with subjection, whether people are going to be subject to one another or not. And in a voluntarily humble way. So what is this really issue all about? It's really even not about head coverings. It's really not about submission. It's about humility. That's the real issue. The real issue below all of these issues is the issue of pride and humility. Are you going to be proud and you're going to rise up and say, I will not be ruled by anyone? Or are you going to be humble and say, you know what? God has designed certain things certain ways so that I will humble myself. Now these are, like I said, these are issues. But the question is, do you submit to Christ? Ultimately, all of us must submit ourselves to Jesus Christ. Everybody has to. He is the head over the church. Is Jesus the head over you? That's really the question, right? And then we got to ask ourselves other questions. Are we willing to submit ourselves to things that God has placed in our lives that we don't necessarily always agree with? Like, for instance, the government. Like, for instance, elders who don't always make decisions you like. Or deacons who don't always make decisions that you like. Or churches, or pastors, or your husband, or whatever. If you're a child, your parents. There's always an opportunity to either submit or to rise up in pride and say, I don't want anything to do with this. So there's always a chain of command. God has made a very clear chain of command. The problem is we don't like it. Right? Agreed? None of us like it. We live, let's just be honest. We live in a country whose whole premise started on rejecting a government over them. That's where we come from. So it's hard to get it out of us. But even more so than that, it's in our DNA, it's in our nature. Now, this manifested itself in a very unique way. In verse 4, we read, every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. So now we start talking about head coverings. You say, where does Paul all of a sudden start talking about head coverings? Because there was something unique going on in Corinth that was culturally different than most churches. It was this head covering thing. Every man who has something on his head, he says, while praying or prophesying, disgraces his head. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces herself. For she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. If a woman does not cover her head, let her have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. Now, that's as clear as mud, right? So what in the world is going on in this church? Here's what's going on in this church. In Corinth, specifically, women were wearing head coverings as a way to indicate physically their submission. Okay? So just imagine that every woman, and obviously we don't have that issue here, we're not, I haven't seen any women coming in here with a head covering on saying, well, that's clearly what's going on in this passage. And I'm not advocating that you come with a head covering. I'm not saying you need to show up next week with a hat or something like that, or a veil over your face. I'm just saying that was going on in this culture. So Paul is explaining to them that these head coverings indicate subjection to someone. This is why it was bad for a man to pray in that way, but right for a woman in Corinth. Just in Corinth, just in this time, just in this place. This is completely cultural. In other words, for these people in this culture, this Eastern culture, women who covered their head with scarves or hats or veils indicated that their submission was to their husband. That's how they indicated it. There was a physical way. Now, in the world that we live in, don't think of America for a second, but are there places in the world today where women wear head coverings to indicate their submission? Yeah, there are. Okay? In the Middle Eastern cultures, specifically, they wear the, whatever they call it, the burqa, the hijab, whatever you want to call that, or they wear that. Why do they wear that? They wear that to indicate their submission to their husband, that their beauty and everything about them is reserved solely for their husband. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that is the way it is. I didn't write the rules, I didn't write all that stuff down. That's just the way they did it. So in that culture, that's the way it was. Now, in the Corinthian culture, that's the same thing that's going on. So what he's saying here is there's two problems. One is that for a man to do something like that, to wear a head covering, would be that he is saying, I am subject to my wife, which would be wrong for him because he's supposed to be the leader. And a woman, for her to do that, would be correct because she is saying, I am in submission to my husband. Now, I don't know what the cultural equivalent is in our culture. Okay? You can make that determination yourself. But what you're doing is physically indicating where you stand by what you wear. Let me just ask you this question. Do you or can you determine by what people wear what is going on inside them in their heart? You can't really in some ways, but in some ways you can, right? You don't really know what's going on inside somebody's heart. You can't know what's going on in their heart. Unless, of course, they're wearing something that specifically says that, like if they were just wearing a shirt that says, I hate Jesus. Then you would have a pretty good indicator to know what's going on the inside, right? And what he's saying is this, these women were doing that. They were indicating by taking their head coverings and throwing them aside and saying, I'm not going to wear this. They were indicating that they were not in subjection to their husbands. See, in that culture, the amazing thing is this, that women weren't wearing their head culture, or their head coverings, because they were rising up and saying, we will not submit ourselves to men. In the Roman world, there were women who were basically saying, we will not have a man to rule over us. They were rejecting marriage. They refused to raise their kids. They refused to provide for their family or be involved in any ways. Some of them were cutting their hair short. Some of them were shaving their head in protest against men, saying that men were bad, men were evil, men were in authority. They were abusing their authority. They were doing things that they should not, and they were essentially the same people that we have today, right? The same people today in culture today. They may not shave their head, they may not cut their hair in a specific way, but they are saying and indicating by everything in their life that they will not be in submission to. And so what he says here in this passage is this. He says, if you're a man and you put on that head covering, what you're telling everybody else is that I give up. I'm not going to be a leader. I'm not going to be the person who tries to benevolently lead my family and my wife and my church, and I'm not going to try to do any of those things. And that is evil in and of itself. And if you're a woman who says, I will not submit to a man, and I'm going to fight him, and I'm going to go to war against him, that also is evil. So both of them are wrong, is what he's saying here. Women who didn't wear a head covering, cut their hair short, were not just in defiance. They were actually indicating in some ways that they were promiscuous. Temple prostitutes wore no head covering because they were obviously trying to attract men. So there was another reason why women weren't doing this. And so culturally, for a woman not to wear a head covering was basically to say, I submit to no one. Nobody. I don't apologize for it. In fact, not only don't apologize for it, I'm in defiance of every male. Every man. So Paul is saying this. He's saying, look, that isn't liberation. That's degradation. You're degrading yourself. The church is supposed to be about submission to Christ and submission to His church. And God has set up His church in a way where men are supposed to lovingly care for their wives. And, the ladies would say, well, I don't want to be in submission to him. And the men would say, well, I don't want to be in submission to Christ either. Nobody wants to be in submission to anybody. That's the point. The point is we're all in the same boat. And like I said, Roman women were attacking marriage, not raising their children, demanding equal rights, and some of them were even cutting their hair short, and they were competing with their own husbands in physical acts against them. Does this sound familiar? This is what's going on in our culture as well. People do these kinds of things. Men were trying to be women, and women were trying to be men. I mean, this is like 21st century, right? I mean, is anything changed in the history of the world? Nothing has changed in the history of the world. And he says, if you do that, you are disgracing your head. If you are a man and you are doing that, you are disgracing your head, which is Christ. If you're a woman who is doing this, you're disgracing your husband, who is your head. See how I told you? This is going directly upstream from the culture that we live in. To deliver this message to you today is not my delight by any stretch of the imagination. I don't say this, and I don't look at this passage and open it up and go, oh, this is going to be awesome to preach. No, I opened up this passage and go, oh boy, this is going to be a tough one. Because people don't want to hear this. People don't want to listen to this. Nobody is on board with this. Now, let me explain to you why God says He does this the way that He does. And let me just explain to you, if you have a problem with this, you do not have a problem with me. You do not have a problem with Paul. You do not have a problem with Peter. Who's your problem with? God. How do I know that? How do I know that this isn't just cultural? How do I know that this isn't just something that only afflicted the Corinthian church? Well, because God set it up that way. Look at verse 7, and we'll show you that the reason He set this up. Now, you may not like His reason, but there's a reason. Look at verse 7. For a man ought to have his head covered. Or not have his head covered. Excuse me, I said it wrong. For a man ought not to have his head covered. Don't cover your head, men, in Corinth, is what he's saying to them. Why? Since he is the image and the glory of God. You are the glory of God. In what way are you the glory of God? You're the glory of God, men, because you represent on earth who God is. You represent God to the rest of the world. And what do you represent about God? You represent His rules, specifically. So there's no pressure on you guys, right? You got to perfectly represent God the way that God wants to be represented to the rest of the world. So what does that mean? That you have to be the one who is in authority. You have to be the one who is His representative. But there's a huge catch to that. That doesn't mean that you get to bulldoze people in doing it. Authority doesn't mean abuse. They are not synonymous. You don't beat people into submission. God says, submit to me. He says, but you must do so willingly. You must lay down your arms against me. And so the very first thing that must happen in salvation is that you submit to Christ. You submit yourself to Christ, who is in submission to God Himself. So men, you are the glory of God when you represent God the way that God is meant to be represented. Can we all agree that there are people in this world, men, who definitely represent what it is like for God to rule? There are godly men, right? Do you know any godly men like this? Like, well, I don't know a lot of them. Yeah, because there's not a lot that exist. Because they do it right, because they are in subjection to God. They say, yes, I have authority, but my authority only comes from God. I don't have any authority outside of that. What does he say about the woman? Well, the woman is the glory of man. And the women are like, I don't like that. I don't like the way that sounds. What does he mean by that? Well, she is the glory of man. She was taken from the man. She was taken from his side. Does that mean that she's inferior? Answer, no. She's not inferior to him. He is like the sun. She is like the moon. She reflects less of the glory of God in that sense because she is not the direct ruler and representative of God. And who set that up? God did. And why did He set it up that way? The answer? I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know why God chose that. He could have chosen the woman just as easily. But it is His divine right to choose, is it not? It is. It's his prerogative. He does whatever He wants. I mean, everything that He does, it is His prerogative. Now I'm thinking of Bobby Brown, His prerogative. Anyway. He says, but the woman is the glory of man. Notice this, for man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. Where's he going back to? All the way back to Genesis. Look at verse 9. For indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but the woman for the man's sake. You know what he says? He says this isn't cultural at all. This goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. God specifically created man and woman in this way, in this order, for a specific reason and purpose, which is to say that the man will be the leader. God could have easily created the man and the woman at the same time. You understand that? I mean, just as easy for him to create the man and the woman. Why does he do it this way? To indicate the way that he wants the created order to go. Which is a problem for both man and woman, right? It's a problem for men who don't want to be leaders, who don't want to take that responsibility on. And women, you may think, oh, you got it so good. Oh, really? Do you have to represent God to the rest of the world? That's a huge responsibility on men. That's why some men run from that responsibility. They don't want to be fathers, they don't want to be dads, so they get the girl pregnant and then they leave. They don't want to be that leader. They don't want that on them. They don't want that pressure on them. And then there are women who say, well, I can do a much better job than the man, so I'll just take over from here. Give me the wheel. And some men are foolish enough to say, here you go. You are better than me. You are smarter than me. Men are evil. We have abused our authority. And so the women can take it because the women are good. And the problem with that is the women are just as evil as the men. So that's the problem that you have. It's not that one is better than the other. It's that they're both corrupted and evil. And this is the problem. God curses the man and the woman. And the curse that he places on them in Genesis 3 verse 17 is that the woman will desire to rule over the man and the man will dominate the woman. So you have a major problem there. All the problems go back to the Garden of Eden. They all go back to this decision. Why did God do it that way? Well, I think it's pretty obvious if you just read the story. What happened in the story? The snake came to the woman. Why did he come to the woman? Some people could be chauvinistic and say, well, because she's weaker. No, that'd be stupid to say that. She was just as much made in the image of God. But he comes to the woman. He deceives the woman. See, the woman was deceived, but the man, not deceived. So the problem is this. God says, because the woman is deceived, because she tried to usurp the role that the man had, she takes the leadership role. She eats the apple first. God curses her and says, your desire will always be that way. And to the man, he looks at him and goes, and you, knucklehead, you let it happen. You were passive. You didn't do what you were supposed to do. You just sat by idly. You said nothing. You did nothing. All you did was go, yep, she's right. And you ate. And for that reason, there's always going to be conflict between the two of you. See God's punishment there? It's pretty clever, right? Deadly, though. This is why we have problems in marriage. This is why we have problems between men and women. This is why men and women compete with each other. This is why they fight each other. This is why they hate each other. And ultimately why they divorce each other. The woman is trying to usurp the power of the man. The man is trying to desperately hold on to that. And so he does one of two things. He either becomes super passive, does nothing about it, or he gets violent. And those are your two extremes. And that's the problem right there, is it not? And where God says the solution is this. If the woman will submit willingly to the man, and the man will treat the woman with love and respect, and there will be harmony in the marriage, and it will be like the Garden of Eden. But if you do not do that, it will be disaster. It'll be a complete mess. Hence the world we live in. It's a perfect plan. God's plan is perfect. If you can accomplish it, the problem is we got two sides of this that are corrupt. Do you not see that? I mean, this is really the problem. The problem isn't men. The problem isn't women. The problem is men and women together. They're a problem. You combine the two of them, it's like nitroglycerin. It just explodes. And so there's a clear indication of what men and women need to do in this passage, right? The men need to be leaders. They need to step up. They need to be the person that God has called them to be, the glory of God. They need to represent God well. And the women need to submit in a gracious and kind way. That is how God set this up. He didn't do this on accident. God thought this one through. He wasn't like, man, I wish I had done a few things differently. Because, man, if I had to go back, I mean, there's a lot of things I'd do differently. No? Then there's verse 10, and this is the one, truthfully, if you can come up to me afterwards and explain it to me, I'd be much appreciated. Verse 10, therefore the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. I don't even know what that means. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to pretend like I have a great answer. I don't have a very good answer. Every answer that I heard, and I heard probably 8 or 10 of them, none of them made any sense. Here's my best guess, and I say guess because this is a guess. I really don't know. But my best guess is simply saying this. The woman is created in the image of God, and so she is his co-ruler with him. He is king, but she is queen. And because of that, there is a sense in which she has some level of authority. She has a great level of authority. She has a great respect. And what kind of authority does she have? Well, she has enough authority that she's over even the angels. So where do you get that from? Well, if you go back to chapter 6, verse 13, 6:30, it says, and he's talking about lawsuits in the Corinthian church, but he says, do you not know that we will judge angels? We, meaning the men and the women, will judge angels. How much more matters of this life, he says. If we're going to judge the angels, then how much more? And so what he's saying is that the women have this role in this world of being submissive, but in the next world, they are co-heirs with Christ. They do not submit to men in the next world. There is a equal standing before God. That's the best I can do with that. So, sorry if I've disappointed you that I know everything. I certainly do not. Now there's some clarification about this issue of submission here in verse 11. However, in the Lord, neither is a woman independent of man, nor a man independent of the woman. Is that clear? Just in case you were thinking that the man could somehow live without the woman, or the woman could live without the man, they need each other. Badly, they need each other. The very first thing in the book of Genesis that is said, it is not good that the man be what? Alone. He needs the woman, amen? He's like, man, I need somebody here. I need some help. God has given me a major command, which is to multiply. Can't do that without some help. And to subdue the earth. Can't do that without some help. I need both of those things. I need help. And God brings all the animals in front of Adam so that he can see every animal has a pair, has a second half to help the other one. And then he brings Adam to the realization that he needs somebody to help him. And so he creates the woman to help the man. That is your primary goal, ladies, is to help the man, because the man needs help. He needs help. Your primary goal is to help the man. Well, help the man do what? Help the man fulfill his God-given role. He can't be the glory of God to the full extent that he needs to be without you. You're integral in that. And the woman, she can't be without the man either. She needs him for other things. They are interdependent upon one another, which is exactly the opposite of what the world says, which is to say that you need nobody. If you're a guy, just be independent. If you're a lady, you just be independent. Have your own career, have your own life, have your own bank account, have your own theology, have your own church, have your own life, and then ultimately your own divorce lawyer. Right? Ultimately, your own divorce lawyer, can't say that word. And that's where we are. Every family needs a father and a mother. Right? It's right in the left hand. Look, can you do everything you need to do with one hand? Sure you could, but do you want to? Do you want to cut off your arm, one of your arms, and just be like, well, I can get through life with just one arm? I mean, people are pretty determined. They'll do a lot of things, right? I mean, like, people do way crazy things. Like, they don't have arms, and they, like, put a paintbrush in their mouth and paint with their mouth. because they are just determined individuals. Well, good for you, but I'd rather have two arms, right? You may not have that choice, but if you do you want to write in on left arm? Or do you just want a right arm? Like, oh, but my right arm is my strong arm. That's the man's arm. And he's strong. Yeah, but you need that other left hand to help you to get through life the way that God has ordained it to happen. The man must rely on the woman must rely on the man. He says, if in verse 13, judge for yourselves. I mean, you be the judge of that. What does the world look like when we have just men and just women? We have single parents. Does it look good for the children? Does it go well for the children? No, it doesn't go well for them at all. Same thing in the church. When we have just men who are just the leaders and no women helping, how does that go for the church? Badly. And when we have just women and no men, how does that go? Badly. It goes bad both ways. And so he's saying, look, that's the case. Now, then he says, does not nature teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? I think where he's going with this is simply this. Look, let's just use a natural expression of things. Men with long hair, not a good idea. Doesn't usually look very good. I'll just be honest, I'll be the first to admit that. 7th grade, I had a mullet. Not a good look. I ain't gonna lie to you. All pictures of that moment have been burned for a reason. Not a good look for guys, right? Yeah, well, there's one guy I know. Yeah, but generally speaking, not a great look. Verse 15, but if a woman has long hair, it's to her glory, for her hair is given to her as a covering. Now, what he's saying is this: women, on the other hand, they look good with long hair. Right, guys? Yeah, I like the one with the long hair. Right? And her hair is given to her as a covering. She has a natural head covering. You don't have to come to church next week with a head covering, ladies. Amen? Because you have a natural head covering. It is called your hair. That's what God says here. Your hair is given to you for a covering. Now, some of you are like, well, I cut my hair short. How long is long? Oh, come on. It's not what he's talking about here. He's using an illustration. He's using an illustration from his culture, because in his culture, women who cut their hair short meant something by it. They shaved their heads, some of them. They cut it so short so that they could look like men. Which is interesting to me, and I don't know if you've considered this, but if men are so evil, why do feminists try to look like them? Right? Men are evil, they're the worst. Let's cut our hair and dress like them. That makes no sense. That just makes no sense. We're going to be just as brutal, just as mean, just as oppressive as the man is because men are evil. It doesn't make any sense. In this culture, it was the same way. I was talking to our guys at our men's breakfast about the thing that the APA, the American Psychology Association, put out that said that men, that basically being a man is toxic masculinity. You're all familiar, obviously. You know what's also toxic? Feminism. Just as toxic. Now, I would argue that what they're really saying isn't that masculinity is toxic, but that chauvinism is toxic. I would agree with that. I would agree that chauvinism is toxic. I hope all the men in here would agree. Chauvinism is toxic. It's not what we're looking for. That is toxic. But feminism is also toxic. Can we agree? They're both toxic. They will both destroy our culture. They'll destroy our families. They'll destroy our churches. That is not what we're aiming at. That is not what we want. But to say that being a man is toxic is offensive to a man. Just as offensive, ladies, it would be if we said, you know what, for you to be feminine is toxic. Immediately you're going to rise up and say, that's evil. Isaiah says it this way, Isaiah 5 verse 20, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. You've switched the labels. You've tried to change it. You make it sound like it's something that's not. He goes on to say, not only woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light, light for darkness, bitter for sweet, sweet for bitter. Is that not what we're doing in our culture with the genders? Switching them and then calling it good. And it is evil. It's wicked. Trying to make men women, women men. That's exactly what he talks about in 1 Corinthians 9, where he says, some of you were in that position, but you were washed. What you need is not to change your gender. It's not for you to have a sex change. It's not for you to start having hormone therapy. It's not for you to start dressing the opposite of your gender, because on the inside you are not what your DNA says that you are. Don't do that. That's evil. That's wicked. You need to be forgiven. You are fighting against what God has said you are. God says he created two kinds of people. Male, female. There are no other categories. There aren't. And yet you have in the California school system, they're wanting to say there are 15 different genders. Just stupidity. Look, even your own logic, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Your chromosomes tell you who you are, aside from the other things that indicate who you are. If you just looked at your chromosomes, you'd know. You either got two X's or an X and a Y. And maybe you're one of those weird people who got a third chromosome. We'll just throw that one out. But always there is a prevalent gender, there's always a prevalent thing. So the question really isn't about all of these things, really. And he gets to the part of this in verse 16, but if one is inclined to be contentious, I love that. If some of you have the internet, no, I'm kidding. If one of you is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. If you want to fight this, he says, go ahead and fight it. Just understand, this is where we stand. This is the definitive truth about what the Bible says. You may not like it. You may disagree with it. You might fight against it. You might be contentious. You might say, I will not submit. I'm a man, and I don't have to do any of that. I'm going to be passive, and I don't have to be a leader. And she can be on her own, and I can do whatever I want. Or you can be a woman and say, I'm going to be under the thumb of any man. You could do all that. You could contend with it. You can fight it. You can go against it. But understand this. You are fighting against the very words of God. Make no mistake. I'm not going to apologize for what this just said here. Men need to stop being passive. Women need to stop being so aggressive. That is not something that God has condoned. He has not made you that way. He knows what you need. He knows what you need. More so than you know what you need. And if somebody's wrong in that scenario, if we've got to say that one of you is wrong, either you or God, it's not God. So he explains to the Corinthians that the attitude of humility was the real issue that he cares about. It's really the issue. It's about being humble. Head coverings aren't the issue here in this. It's just a vehicle to talk about the real issue. Cultural expressions are not really the issue either. All of this is a smokescreen for whether you're proud or whether you're humble. I think by now you probably figure out the application, right? Men, are you being passive as leaders in your own home and in the church? Are you afraid to get involved? Are you afraid to do anything? Will you not step up and be the leader that God has made you to be? Not every guy is a raw vocal leader, but somebody who leads from the front and says, this is the way that we're going to do it, and I'm going to show you and demonstrate that. You may have blown it in the past. I mean, you may have massively screwed it up so badly that your wife might look at you and other women might look at you and go, that guy's a total loser. You need to start from scratch and apologize and go back to your wife and your kids and say, I blew it, and I would really like to do things right. And become the leader that God has made you to be the glory of God, the way He's made you to be. And then the ladies, the obvious application is you need to willingly submit yourself to that guy. Say, look, if he's going to follow Christ, I will submit myself to him. I will follow him. And what you're not saying is this: if he calls me to sin, I'm going to sin. Because Jesus is a higher authority than your husband. If he says, I don't want you reading your Bible, I don't want you going to church, you don't need to listen to that guy. Because the Bible tells you otherwise. If he's calling you to do evil, don't do evil. You say, I'd love to submit to you, but I can't do that because the Bible calls me to do this. And I will submit to you in other areas, but I cannot submit to you when it comes to those issues. The same way that we deal with our government, the same way we deal with everything that's in authority over us. God is the highest authority. Amen? He is. It doesn't matter. So if our government tells us to do something, our school tells us to do something, this person tells us to do something, we simply say to them, look, I would love to support you, I'd love to help you, but I can't do that because you're violating the scriptures. But if they ask us to do something that's reasonable, we say, okay, I'll do it. Because God has called me to love and support those who are in authority over us. I don't expect you to amen that one, because that's a tough one. But should in your heart, if you're humble, if you're really seeking God and you really want to know what he wants you to do, it's pretty obvious. It's nothing to do with head coverings. I do not expect any woman next week to show up with a head covering. If you do, you miss the point. And the same thing with the men. It has nothing to do with whether you wear a head covering or not. God, we do thank you for your word. God, it does cut through all of the cultural problems that we have. It is clear, it is concise, and sometimes it cuts us to the heart, God. I know for me this has been a hard one to preach because I'm afraid that people will misunderstand it, that they will look at it and say, what you're saying is just cultural and it's chauvinistic and you're being oppressive towards women. And the men might look at that and say, well, you're just being too hard on me, you don't know me. God, I pray that none of those things would be the case, that God, you would impress it upon their heart. This is really between you and them. I have nothing to do with this. I am just the mailman. I don't write the mail, I just deliver it. Now, these are truths that need to get deep down into our soul, and they might not be easy things to accept. God, I do pray that these things would be on our hearts. God, this is not the only passage in the New Testament that talks about these things. God, you mentioned it in other places, and so this is obviously something that keeps coming up because it's a problem with the human heart. It's not just about culture. God, help us to look past our culture, look past our time, and see, God, this is about our obedience to you. And help us to willingly, lovingly submit to the authority in our life, whether we're men or women. We pray this in your name.